Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I work in fisheries management on the River Dee in Scotland. Just to start with a bit of an overview of Scotland, and in Scotland we use rod catches as a sort of parallel to our salmon stock size. We also separate out the spring salmon stock in terms of reporting catches as they show different trends. And for us, spring salmon are those fish that enter the river before the 1st of June each year. So you can see from this graph of rod catches, the spring salmon are in green, and there's been a decline in our spring salmon stocks since the 1960s. The summer and autumn stocks of fish have shown a much later decline, although in part that's due to the reduction in netting that started in the 1980s, so that's allowed greater escapement of fish back into our rivers. In 2021, Scotland caught 35,000 salmon on the rod catch. Just to give you an indication of the scale of the decline, that is less than half of what we once used to catch on the River Dee for the export trade alone. So it really is a fraction of what we used to catch. So this is a figure for the Dee. Like pretty much all Scottish rivers, it's seen a decline in salmon stocks. But what's particular about the Dee is that it used to be very much a spring salmon dominated river. It was considered at one point, one of the best rivers in the world where you could catch a spring salmon. And really the early part of this graph sort of backs that up. In the 1950s to 1970s, it's the spring stocks that make up the vast majority of our annual rod catches. Between 4,000 and 11,000 spring salmon were caught each year. I think what this graph really shows overall is that the overall decline on the Dee in its salmon stocks has been driven by that decline in our spring substock. That decline over these last 70 years amounts to about a 25% reduction in spring fish per decade. And of course, this is only a snapshot in time. It's the last 70 years. We have fairly good evidence of the decline going back at least as far as the 1800s, but perhaps a long way before that as well. So we describe the spring stock based on the time that they come into the river. Perhaps a more useful definition would be fish that come into the river and don't feed after their last winter at sea, and we can tell that from their scale samples. They really do seem to be a separate, a distinct substock. There's a variety of evidence, not least that they show different trends to the later running fish, but also there's genetic evidence and shown that run timing is a heritable trait as well. So this separate substock is totally comprised of multi-sea winter fish, and our spring fish, when they come back, they tend to head to the headwaters of catchments to spawn, although it's most apparent in the more linear, simple river catchments, such as the River Dee. So marked out on the right is the River Dee, and our spring fish hail from that upper half of the catchment, and you can possibly make out on the figure that it's a different environment in that upper half. It's a lot more high altitude sites. So our spring fish are likely a result of not only genetics, but also a different rearing environment. And that goes to influence the life history traits of this substock as well. So why have our spring salmon declined? Well, I think everybody knows about the marine mortality increasing over the last few decades. For Scotland, the figures are marine survival back in the 1960s used to be 40%, so 40% of our smolts would return to spawn as adults, but we're now down to about 2 to 3%. And as all of our spring fish are multi-sea winter fish, they tend to have an overall higher marine mortality because they've been at spring out at sea longer compared to our summer and autumn stocks, which do have a component of grilse, those one-sea winter fish. But there's also the freshwater environment to consider as well. And really, our spring salmon, hailing from the headwaters, are under the most severe pressure. pretty much all of Scottish river catchments have been degraded over many centuries. They're not the healthy ecosystems they once were that sustained, big populations of fish. On the Dee, in the upper catchment in our headwaters, the biggest issues come from overgrazing by uncontrolled numbers of deer, as well as hillside sheep grazing, also from the burning of heather moorland and the drainage of hillsides as well. So all of these factors have gone to really change the ecosystem that was once there. There's no longer the forest that there was. So the picture on the right is our upwaters of the Dee catchment, and you can see what a barren landscape it now is. So it's not really a surprise to know that that is producing a lot less fish than it used to do. So how do we get our spring salmon back? Well, I think although we probably all agree that the biggest issues is the marine mortality, there's no doubt that pressures in the freshwater environment are contributing. And really the freshwater and the marine environment are linked. There's more and more evidence of how the development of juvenile fish in our freshwater ecosystems impact the fate of these fish once they go to sea. So, for example, the growth and the health of our juvenile fish determines their survival at sea. And there is evidence that the larger the smolt, the better its sea survival is. So the take-home message for us is we need to do everything we can to ensure that our freshwater environment provides the right conditions to produce healthy, large smolts. And there's also the adult salmon as well to consider. We know that egg production is dependent on the fish condition and the stress they experience. So again, making freshwater conditions ideal for adult fish as well is really important. So we have, sorry, I've lost my place. The pressure to act urgently is really huge because we have climate change pressures now that are impacting on both our marine and our freshwater environments. In the marine environment, there's a lot of evidence of northerly movements of many marine species, which is starting to be apparent. So the implications of marine mortality through predation and through food supply and also disease risk may be being increased already by these climate changes that are already occurring. And in the freshwater environment as well, heating of rivers is the biggest threat to our Scottish salmon for the future. Monitoring throughout Scotland by Scottish Government scientists has predicted what rivers are most vulnerable of heating up and by how much they'll heat up by. And it really it's not good news for a species that needs cold oxygenated water. This area on the left is part of their predictive models, and I've outlined the upper Dee catchment, and it's really the areas in yellow that are our greatest concern. So they're the areas that are most exposed to sunlight. They have no shade, they're wide and they're shallow, so they absorb heat quickly. And in the future, we're concerned that they won't be able to sustain salmon populations. Now, water temperatures above 23 degrees create thermal stress in salmon, so they stop feeding and they're more vulnerable to predators and to disease. In 2018, over 2/3 of Scottish rivers experienced this thermal stress. And on the River Dee, we experienced temperatures of over 27 degrees. So we are already there, and these fish are already dealing with these sort of temperatures. It's not just water temperatures. Our water regulators in Scotland are predicting that every 1 out of 2 years in the future we will suffer from drought in Scotland. And alongside drought, they're also predicting much more frequent and more severe flood events as well. So this is really going to impact on our salmon in the freshwater environment, particularly in the spawning gravels and the nursery areas for them. In addition to that, we have the snowmelt. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen snow cover disappearing in Scotland, and the snowmelt used to be really important in our springtime for feeding the rivers and assisting with the smolt migration, not as well as the spring salmon fishery itself, but that is now really declining, and we are seeing that in the spring flow conditions. So we're now really in a race against time to make our rivers more resilient to the changing climate and suitable for our salmon. Now, restoration of our upland catchment is really key for us to look after our spring salmon in this changing environment. And we need to work at the landscape scale. We no longer have time for just small case studies. Our key restorative method is the reintroduction of trees into our catchment. Like I say, our upper catchment is really denuded, but trees provide shading and can really combat the rising temperatures brought about by climate change. So in our upper catchment, we are aiming to plant trees along 50% of the riverbanks to reduce stream temperatures by between 2 and 3 degrees. Of course, I think you know trees don't just provide shade, they provide a lot of benefits to the habitat and to biodiversity in general, and specifically to salmon. So they add nutrients into the watercourses through leaf litter, which feeds the invertebrates. Their roots help bind riverbanks and prevent bank erosion. They provide fallen branches and actually the trees themselves to create diverse in-stream habitat. And if they're planted at a good enough scale, they can help with natural flood management and help to sort of reduce runoff rates into rivers. So they really do provide a lot of benefits. And we know that we've got over 300 kilometres of streams in the Dee that are particularly vulnerable to these rising water temperatures, and that was the map with the areas in yellow I just showed. So we have begun a tree planting campaign, a 1 million tree campaign, to plant trees along the riverbanks to achieve this. And it's really got a lot of public support because of the other benefits that trees bring with it. And so far we've planted 320,000 trees. But I think the 1 million trees will be just the first target, and we'll keep going once we reach that. So trees are the heart of our restoration programme, but connected to the tree planting, we've also been installing large woody structures into our streams, which are comprised of wind-blown trees. So these replicate natural treefall. They'd always be found in forested streams, and they provide a lot of benefits in terms of in-stream habitat creation. They help provide protection from floods and from predators, and they help trap nutrients and stop nutrients being washed out of our river systems. So just in terms of the photos, the one on the left shows natural wind-blown trees. The picture in the middle is one of our created large woody structures, and so is the one on the right. And that aerial shot on the right, I think, really nicely shows how these trees affect habitat within a single season. There's been scour at the front of the structure, creating a deep pool. There's now faster velocity water around the edges of the structure, and then there's substrate deposition at the tail end, giving us really good spawning gravels and nursery areas. So they provide that real complex variety of habitats that our salmon need at all stages of the life cycle. Our target is to install these every 100 metres of upland river stream as well. We've also been creating and restoring wetland sites to really get our floodplains working again, so that they hold water in high flow events and then they release water in low flow events. So in terms of the pictures, on the left, we're removing a levee to connect the river to its floodplain. On the top right, we've been creating sort of small, shallow wetland ponds, just using a digger to remove turf. And the bottom right is a picture of one of our leaky dams that we're putting into the feeder streams of side tributaries. These hold back the water when it's high flow, but they allow low flow waters to move through. And we've also been reinstating some of the old river channels that used to take floodwaters, but they were blocked previously to drain the floodlands, primarily to make it more suitable for agriculture. So this is a before and after shot of one we did a couple of years ago. And a couple of great benefits from this is, it's easy work and it immediately gives us areas to store floodwater or to take floodwater, but also we're seeing just how valuable this habitat is for spawning fish and for juvenile fish as well, because we're finding more of our river channels are receiving such high floodwaters that there's really high velocity environment and they're starting to wash out the spawning gravels. So we're losing spawning gravels in our rivers at the moment. These flood channels provide a much lower energy environment where fish can spawn and where juvenile fish can be reared. And then my final point is the addition of nutrients that we're starting to trial as well. And this is really to provide the lost nutrients and basically fish food for our juvenile fish in the system. Our trials have involved putting in fish food and also deer legs, which are high in phosphate. At the moment, we haven't seen any improvements in fish biomass or fish numbers, but that's something we're continuing to explore. I'm happy to chat and get ideas from people about this later. So then, really just to conclude, our spring salmon are particularly vulnerable because they spend longer at sea and they're dependent on our headwater systems. And with the biggest threat of all, climate change, our rivers really need to be resilient to these changing environments. And to deal with this, habitat restoration is key. For us, it's the planting of native woodlands along riverbanks. It's providing diverse in-stream habitat to provide pools and shelter for fish. And it's allowing our floodplains and flood channels to function once more. And I'll end there. But thank you very much.